Michael Ashford had checked his watch 4 times in the last 11 minutes, a habit left over from 30 years of managing insurance claims on a strict schedule. Though today, there was no schedule to keep. The rum punch in his hand had gone warm at the edges. He hadn't taken more than one sip. Around him, the upper deck of the ship hummed with the particular noise of people who had decided, for 1 week, that their lives were good. He had almost not come on this trip at all. His daughter Grace had booked it herself, slid the confirmation across the dinner table, and told him plainly that 4 years was long enough to stop living like a man waiting for his own funeral. He had let her win the argument because some small, tired part of him agreed with her. For years earlier, his wife Diane had gone out on their boat alone during a storm warning. He had begged her to wait out. The Coast Guard searched for 11 days. They recovered debris, a life jacket, a shoe. They never recovered a body strong enough for visual identification, and the case was closed on a DNA match from a private forensics lab, handled quietly and efficiently by their family attorney, a man named Robert Sinclair, who Michael remembered being unusually calm through the entire process, calmer than a man should be while telling his client his wife was gone. Michael had not questioned it then. Grief does not leave much room for questioning the people who are helping you survive it. He had loved her plainly, without complication, for 22 years. He remembered the small things now, the particular way her laugh caught slightly at the top before it settled, the thin silver pendant necklace shaped like a compass that he had given her on their honeymoon, a piece she wore almost daily for 2 decades and never once took off, even for sleep. He had sold their house because he could not stand being in it alone. He had raised their daughter without her. He had visited an empty grave every year and told himself the ocean had at least been merciful, taking her somewhere peaceful, somewhere better than however she might have suffered. He heard the laugh before he understood why his whole body had gone still. It came from the breakfast buffet, 30 feet away, familiar in a way that reached past thought and landed somewhere in his chest. He told himself it was a stranger, someone with a similar rhythm to her voice, because that was the reasonable explanation, the explanation a grieving man's mind offers him first. Then she turned slightly to reach for a plate, and the small silver pendant at her throat caught the morning light, the same compass-shaped pendant he had fastened around her neck on a beach in the Bahamas 23 years earlier, a piece of jewelry so specific, so singular, that no coincidence could explain it away. She was tanned, rested, laughing, and leaning into the arm of a man Michael had never seen before in his life, a man with silver at his temples and the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once had to check a price tag. Michael did not stand. He did not make a sound. He set his phone on the table, opened the camera without looking away from her face, and took the picture. What Michael Ashford did next would unravel a lie that had been built years before he ever stepped foot on this ship. A lie funded, in part, by $2 million that was never supposed to have been paid out at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Michael did not approach her. He did not confront her. He simply stood at the rail with his phone in his pocket and let 3 questions settle over him like weight he had been carrying without knowing it. Had Diane faked her own death, or had something happened after the accident that forced her into hiding? Who had helped her disappear so completely that a professional insurance investigator, a man who had spent his career catching exactly this kind of fraud, never once suspected his own wife? And if she had planned this, if the woman he mourned for 4 years had chosen to let him grieve rather than simply asking for a divorce, then what kind of person had he actually married? He thought of attorney Robert Sinclair, calm through every step of the claim, and felt something shift uncomfortably behind his ribs. He thought of the $2 million, sitting for years in accounts he had barely touched, because spending it had always felt, in some way he could not name, like spending money that belonged to a dead woman rather than a living one. He thought of his daughter, Grace, 22 now, who still drove out to a headstone every October and stood there for exactly as long as it took to say the things she needed to say, then left without crying, because she had told Michael once that crying at a grave with no body in it felt like performing grief for an audience that wasn't there. He began quietly to follow, not confront, not question, Simply follow, the way a man follows a shape at the edge of his vision that he is not yet ready to name directly. He needed to know her new name before he said his own old one out loud. He needed to know how long this had taken to build, because a lie this complete does not happen in a matter of weeks. It takes months, sometimes years, of quiet preparation, forged paperwork, a second identity assembled piece by piece while the first one is still smiling at breakfast tables and signing school permission slips. Michael understood paperwork. He understood fraud from the other side of a claims desk. What he did not yet understand was how much of it had happened inside his own home. There was a version of that morning where Michael simply turned around, walked back to his cabin, and told himself he had imagined the whole thing. A version where he let the ship carry him quietly through the rest of the week without ever confirming what his body already knew to be true. He considered it briefly, standing at that rail. It would have been easier, in the short term, to let the mystery remain a mystery, to go home and continue grieving a woman who was, as far as everyone else in his life still believed, resting somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. But easier was not the same as possible, not anymore, not once he had seen that pennant catch the light. Michael and Diane had met at a community fundraiser in Savannah when he was 29 and she was 26, and for the first several years of their marriage, people used to say they were the kind of couple other couples measured themselves against. Diane taught piano lessons out of their living room on weekday afternoons. Michael worked long hours reviewing claims, coming home to the sound of a child stumbling through scales, and he never once resented it. They had graced 2 years into the marriage, and Diane became the kind of mother who remembered every teacher's name, every allergy, every small fear her daughter carried. For most of their marriage, Michael believed, without needing to examine it closely, that he understood his wife completely. It would take him years to realize that the version of Diane he loved was only the version she had allowed him to see. Their honeymoon, a modest week on a small island in the Bahamas that neither of them could easily afford at the time, remained one of Michael's clearest early memories of the marriage. On their last evening there, walking a stretch of beach at sunset, Michael had given her the compass pendant, half joke and half sincerity, telling her it was so she would always be able to find her way back to him no matter where life took either of them. Diane had laughed at the sentiment, called it corny, and put on anyway, and had worn it nearly every day for the next 22 years, through pregnancy, through the lean years before his promotion, through piano recitals and parent-teacher conferences, a small constant detail woven so completely into his image of her that he would later say he had stopped consciously seeing it at all. The way a person stops noticing their own wedding ring. Their early years were not without ordinary strain. Money was tight before Michael's promotion, and Diane had once quietly taken on extra students, working evenings without telling him, because she did not want him to feel he was failing to provide. He learned this only later, from a neighbor, and it had struck him at the time as evidence of how deeply considerate she was, how much she managed on her own rather than burden him. He would come to see this same quality differently. Years afterward, once he understood how practiced she had become at managing entire realities without his knowledge, how naturally the skill of keeping something hidden seemed to sit with her, long before there was anything as large as a fake death to hide. Michael's mother, still living at the time, and close to Diane in a way she had never quite been with either of Michael's previous relationships, would later tell reporters that she had always found Diane slightly difficult to fully know, a woman who listened more than she revealed, who could sit through an entire family dinner offering warmth and attentiveness without ever once volunteering anything about her own inner life. At the time, this had simply seemed like a quality of graciousness, a woman who made space for others rather than centering herself. It would take the events of the cruise for anyone in the family to reconsider whether that same quality had, all along, been something closer to a well-practiced discipline of concealment. The cracks did not arrive all at once. They arrived the way water finds a foundation, slowly, in places nobody thinks to check. In the 2 years before the accident, Diane began taking weekend trips with friends from her book club, trips that grew longer, more frequent, and increasingly vague in the retelling. She started keeping her phone face down on the counter, a small habit that Michael noticed and dismissed the way people dismiss things they are not ready to investigate in their own homes. There were withdrawals from a joint savings account that Diane explained away as gifts for Grace, a new dress, a birthday present, small enough each time to avoid a real conversation, large enough that they eventually added up to nearly $40,000, money Michael would not think to question until years later. What Michael remembers most from that period is not suspicion, but a kind of low, persistent loneliness inside his own marriage, the sense that his wife was present in the house, but somewhere else entirely in her mind. He asked her once, gently, over dinner, if something was wrong, and she had looked at him with an expression he now recognizes as practiced sympathy, and told him she was simply tired, that raising a teenager and running a small piano studio left little room for anything else. He believed her, because believing her was easier than the alternative, and because 20 years of marriage teaches a person to trust the face across the table more than the small, cold feeling in his own stomach. Grace remembers this period differently than her father does. She recalls her mother becoming suddenly, intensely present in small bursts, taking her shopping without occasion, sitting through entire movies she had no interest in, asking questions about Grace's friends with an attentiveness that felt, at the time, like closeness, and which Grace would later come to recognize as something closer to a woman saying goodbye without knowing how to say it plainly. Diane never raised her voice in those final 2 years. She became, if anything, gentler, softer at the edges, a woman quietly rehearsing tenderness for a version of her family she was already planning to leave behind. There was a particular Sunday, nearly a year before the accident, that Grace would return to often in the years afterward, once she understood what she was actually looking back at. Diane had taken her to the coast on what she called a mother-daughter day, just the two of them, no occasion attached to it. They had walked the shoreline for hours, and Diane had talked, unprompted, about what she hoped for Grace's future, about independence, about never building a life so tightly wound around another person that leaving it felt impossible. At the time, Grace had taken it as motherly wisdom, the kind offered freely and without weight. She would later wonder whether her mother had been rehearsing an explanation for a choice she had already made, testing the words out loud on the one person she could not yet tell the truth to. Michael, for his part, remembers the period before the accident as one of the better stretches of their marriage, not the worst. He recalls Diane initiating trips together, suggesting date nights they had not had in years, a warmth he attributed at the time to a couple rediscovering each other after the busy years of raising a teenager. He did not know, could not have known, that some of what read to him as renewed affection was, in Diane's later account to investigators, something closer to guilt, a woman trying to give her husband something good to hold onto before she disappeared from his life entirely. It is a detail that still visibly unsettles him when he discusses it, the idea that some of his warmest memories of his wife may have been generated, at least in part, by her own private countdown toward leaving. Diane's book club friends, interviewed years later once the truth surfaced, described a woman who had grown quietly evasive about her weekend trips in ways they noticed, but never questioned closely, assuming, as friends often do, that whatever she was managing was simply hers to manage. One friend recalled Diane asking, almost offhandedly, whether anyone had ever known someone who started completely over somewhere new, a question that had seemed at the time like idle conversation and which took on an entirely different weight once her disappearance turned out to be exactly that. Another member of the book club recalled a smaller, stranger detail she had never thought worth mentioning until investigators came asking, that Diane had once, during a discussion of a novel about a woman who vanishes from her own life, grown unusually quiet, then said, almost to herself, that she sometimes envied characters who got to simply disappear rather than explain themselves to everyone who thought they had a claim on knowing where you were. At the time, the room had laughed it off as a comment on the book. In hindsight, several of the women agreed. It had been the clearest thing Diane ever said to any of them about what she was actually planning. Michael's own career gives this backstory a particular weight that friends and family have returned to often since the truth came out. He had spent nearly 3 decades reviewing insurance claims, trained specifically to notice the small inconsistencies that separate a genuine loss from manufactured one. A delay in reporting, a policy increase shortly before a loss, a beneficiary too eager to finalize paperwork. Colleagues described him as one of the most careful reviewers in his division, a man who had personally flagged and unraveled several fraudulent claims over the years, occasionally involving spouses who had staged smaller losses, a stolen car that was not stolen, a fire that started under suspicious circumstances. He had built a reputation, quiet but well known within his company, for being nearly impossible to deceive on paper. It is this exact skill, colleagues would later note with a kind of uneasy sympathy, that makes the 4 years that followed Diane's disappearance so difficult to fully explain. Grief, it turns out, does not respect professional expertise. Michael has said since that he approached his wife's case not as an investigator, but as a husband, and that the moment he stopped applying his training to his own life was the moment his wife needed him to stop the most. He has wondered, in the years since, whether some part of him sensed something was wrong and simply refused, out of love or exhaustion or both, to let himself look at it directly. Their 20th wedding anniversary, celebrated just under 2 years before the accident, would become one of the memories Michael returned to most often once the truth surfaced, turning it over for anything he might have missed. Diane had planned the entire evening herself. A quiet dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, a handwritten card describing, in detail, moments from their marriage she said she never wanted to forget, a Sunday morning years earlier, a hospital waiting room the night Grace was born, a rainstorm on a camping trip that had ruined their tent and left them laughing anyway. Michael kept that card in his desk drawer for years afterward, reading it occasionally during the hardest stretches of his grief, drawing comfort from its specificity, its warmth, evidence, he believed, of exactly how deeply she had loved him. He has since had to sit with the possibility that the card, however genuine it may have felt in the moment she wrote it, was also, perhaps, a woman quietly saying goodbye to a marriage she had already begun planning to leave, memorializing what had been good precisely because she knew it was ending. Whether it was one thing or the other, or somehow both at once, remains, for Michael, one of the more difficult reconciliations the entire ordeal has forced him to make, the possibility that love and departure are not always as separate as people assume them to be. The night before the accident, Diane told Michael she needed the water to clear her head and asked to take the boat out alone the following morning despite a storm advisory posted for the coast. Michael argued against it, more forcefully than he had argued about anything in years, and she had softened, kissed him, told him he worried too much, and promised to be back before noon. He watched her leave the dock from the kitchen window, coffee in hand, and felt an unease he could not name and did not act on. He would replay that morning for years afterward, the particular way she had turned at the end of the dock and waved, a wave that seemed, in hindsight, less like a goodbye for the afternoon and more like a goodbye meant to last. Grace, 17 at the time, was still asleep when her mother left that morning, and would later say the last real memory she has of Diane is not of that final day at all, but of the night before when Diane came in her room unprompted, sat on the edge of the bed, and talked with her for nearly an hour about nothing in particular, her upcoming exams, a boy Grace liked, a movie they'd both wanted to see. Grace remembers it as an unusually long conversation for a school night, one that ended with Diane holding her a little longer than usual before turning off the light. At the time, it felt simply like an ordinary act of affection. Grace would spend years afterward turning that final hour over in her memory, first as a source of comfort, and later, once the truth surfaced, as something closer to a mother saying a goodbye she could not yet bring herself to name. By 10 that morning, the storm had intensified far beyond the forecast, and by early afternoon, the Coast Guard had been notified that Diane Ashford's boat had not returned to its slip and could not be reached by radio. Michael remembers standing at the marina as the sky turned the color of wet slate, watching other men's boats come in one after another while his wife's slip stayed empty. A dockhand, a young man named Terry who had known Diane casually for years, mentioned to investigators much later that he thought he'd seen her transfer something, a bag, possibly a second set of keys, into a car parked at the far end of the lot that morning, a detail that was noted, filed, and never followed up on at the time because there was no reason yet to suspect anything beyond tragedy. Terry, the young dockhand who had known Diane casually for years, would later tell investigators that something about that final morning had felt slightly off to him at the time, though he could not have said exactly what. Diane had arrived earlier than her usual pattern, had loaded a duffel bag onto the boat that seemed larger than what a short morning trip would require, and had asked him, almost in passing, which channels tended to have the least boat traffic on weekday mornings, a question he answered without thinking twice about it, assuming she simply wanted a quiet ride. He remembered her thanking him with unusual warmth, a hand briefly on his arm, a goodbye that lingered slightly longer than the ordinary exchanges they'd had over the years. None of it registered as strange until years later, when a detective called to ask him to recall, in as much detail as possible, everything about that particular morning. The search lasted 11 days. Coast Guard vessels combed 60 miles of coastline, and volunteers walked beaches at dawn, some of them parents of children from Diane's piano studio, all of them holding onto a hope that thinned a little more with each passing day. Michael sat by the phone each night, unable to sleep, replaying the argument from the evening before, wondering if different words might have kept her home. On the 12th day, searchers recovered debris consistent with the boat, along with a single life jacket, but no body was ever found, a detail the medical examiner attributed to strong currents and warm water, an explanation that satisfied everyone involved because no one had any reason yet to look for another one. The search became something of a community event in the small coastal town, drawing volunteers who had never met Diane personally, but who showed up regardless, the way small towns do when tragedy touches one of their own. Local news covered the story for nearly 2 weeks, interviewing tearful former piano students and neighbors who described Diane as endlessly kind, a woman who had once organized a meal delivery rotation for a sick neighbor she barely knew. Michael gave one brief interview during the search, standing at the marina with Grace's hand in his, asking the public to keep looking, a clip that would resurface years later, painfully, once the truth came out, recirculated by people debating whether his grief in that moment had been genuine or itself a kind of performance. A debate Michael has said he finds almost unbearable to watch, knowing exactly how real that grief was at the time. Attorney Robert Sinclair, a longtime family friend, guided Michael through the process of having Diane declared legally deceased, a process that typically takes years, but which moved, in this case, with an efficiency Michael would only later come question. Sinclair handled every form personally, arranged meetings with the insurance carrier himself, rather than letting Michael navigate the calls alone, and repeatedly told Michael not to trouble himself with the details, that he would manage everything so Michael could focus on Grace. At the time, Michael was deeply grateful. He would come to remember this generosity as one of the more carefully constructed parts of the entire arrangement. The funeral was held 6 weeks after the storm, attended by nearly 200 people, and Michael remembers almost none of it, only the weight of Grace's hand in his, and the strange, hollow relief of finally having somewhere to stand and grieve. For 18 months, the insurance claim moved through the system, and Michael, a man who had spent his career on the other side of exactly this kind of paperwork, noticed nothing unusual about how smoothly it went. The $2 million policy paid out in full. He used part of it to pay off the house, part of it to fund Grace's college savings, and quietly set the rest aside, unable to bring himself to spend money that felt, in some way he could not articulate, like it belonged to Diane rather than to him. He raised Grace alone through the remainder of her adolescence, learned to braid hair from internet videos at midnight, sat through school plays with an empty seat beside him, and told himself, the way grieving people do, that he was managing. The house on Maple Run became, in those years, a place suspended between two states, too full of Diane's presence to feel empty, too empty of her actual presence to feel whole. Michael kept her side of the closet untouched for the better part of a year before Grace, gently, suggested it might help to finally clear it out. He donated most of it to a women's shelter 2 towns over, keeping only a single cardigan that still, faintly, carried her perfume, a garment he never wore and never discarded, folded at the bottom of a drawer he opened perhaps twice a year. He would later describe this period, when asked, not as sadness exactly, but as a kind of suspended waiting, though at the time he could not have said what he believed he was waiting for. Small details resurfaced over those years that Michael dismissed at the time and would later revisit with a different eye. A family friend mentioned once, in passing, seeing a woman who looked remarkably like Diane at an airport in Miami, and Michael had gently explained that grief plays tricks on people who love someone. A life insurance representative had called 8 months after the payout with a routine follow-up question about beneficiary paperwork, and something in her tone had struck Michael as oddly careful, though he could not say why at the time. Attorney Robert Sinclair had, on more than one occasion, discouraged Michael from requesting a more detailed accounting of the estate, citing the emotional toll of reopening old paperwork, advice Michael accepted gratefully at the time, and would later recognize as strangely specific for a man simply trying to protect a grieving friend. The friend who spotted her in Miami, a former neighbor named Sandra who had known Diane for over a decade, would later describe the encounter in considerably more detail than she had originally shared with Michael. She said the woman had been standing near a departures board, dressed differently than Diane ever dressed, hair a shade lighter, but with an unmistakable way of tilting her head while reading a screen that Sandra recognized instantly. She had almost approached, she said, before the woman moved quickly toward a gate and disappeared into the crowd, and by the time Sandra second-guessed herself and decided it couldn't possibly have been her, there was no one left to find. She mentioned it to Michael only once, briefly, and never brought it up again after his gentle dismissal, assuming, as he had, that she had simply been mistaken. Grace, meanwhile, grew into a young woman who rarely spoke about her mother, not out of a lack of feeling, but out of a kind of protective silence she had built for her father's sake as much as her own. She kept a single photograph of Diane on her desk through college, a photograph from a birthday years before the accident, and told roommates, when asked, only that her mother had died in a boating accident, a sentence she had repeated so many times it had worn smooth, like a stone handled too often. She never once suspected there was another version of the story. Why would she? No child imagines her mother choosing to let her grieve rather than simply saying goodbye and walking out the front door. Detective Carla Whitmore, who had overseen the original search and closed the case as an accidental drowning, moved on to other work over those years, the file sitting untouched in storage. One closed case among hundreds. She would later describe, in an interview after the truth came out, a small detail that had nagged at her at the time and which she had never pursued, the fact that the DNA identification had come back unusually quickly from a small private forensics lab rather than the state's usual crime lab, a shortcut that saved weeks of processing time and which she had, in the moment, simply been grateful for rather than suspicious of. It is a detail, she says, she has thought about often since. Michael marked the anniversary of the accident every year in the same quiet way. He drove out to the cemetery alone before Grace was awake, stood at the headstone for exactly as long as it took to say a few words he never repeated to anyone, and then drove to the marina where he sat in his car and watched the water for a while before going home. Neighbors who noticed the ritual over the years assumed it was simply grief finding its own rhythm, the kind of private mourning that never fully leaves a person. None of them, including Michael himself, ever considered that the woman he was mourning might be standing in a kitchen 3 hours away, making coffee, checking a phone under a name that was not her own. He dated only once during those 4 years, a brief and gentle relationship with a woman named Patricia from his office, which ended not from any conflict but from Michael's own inability to fully arrive in it. Patricia told him once, kindly, that he seemed like a man still waiting for someone to come back, and Michael had laughed it off at the time, telling her that Diane was gone, that there was nothing left to wait for. He would think about that conversation often in the months after the cruise, turning it over with a kind of quiet, uncomfortable wonder at how close Patricia had come to a truth neither of them could have imagined. Grace, meanwhile, built a life increasingly independent of her father's grief, though she carried her own version of it quietly. She majored in psychology in college, drawn, she admitted much later, to questions about why people make the choices they make, without ever consciously connecting that interest to the unresolved shape of her mother's death. She kept photographs, attended therapy sporadically, and told very few people the full story of how her mother had died, preferring the shorter version: an accident, a storm, a body never found, because the longer version required an emotional accounting she was not always prepared to give strangers. Looking back on those 18 months, investigators would later identify at least 3 separate points where a closer look might have unraveled the fraud years earlier. The unusually quick DNA identification from an out-of-network lab. The insurance claim's rapid, low-friction approval, aided quietly by Sinclair's personal relationships within the claims department. In a single wire transfer, 6 months after the payout, moving a modest sum from the Ashford estate account to a shell entity that investigators would later trace back to the apartment rented under the name Danielle Marsh, a transfer that had been coded, at the time, as a routine estate management fee and never separately reviewed. Each of these points, taken alone, appeared unremarkable. Together, they formed the outline of a fraud that simply required someone to look at all 3 at once, something no one had reason to do until a photograph on a cruise ship changed everything. The exchange with the ship's dinner hostess had happened almost by accident. Michael, trailing several paces behind the couple, had lingered near the reservation podium long enough to hear the hostess greet Diane by name, a moment that gave him, for the first time, solid confirmation of the identity she had built. He remembers standing there afterward, ordering a drink he did not want simply to justify staying near the podium a moment longer. Watching the hostess make small talk about the couple's dinner preferences, comfortable and familiar, the kind of rapport that only builds over repeated interactions, suggesting this was not the couple's first cruise together, and likely not their 5th. Aboard the ship, Michael followed Diane and the man beside her at a careful distance, close enough to hear fragments of conversation, far enough to avoid recognition. He learned, from that same exchange with the ship's dinner hostess, that his wife was now introducing herself as Danielle Marsh, and that her companion, a man with silver at his temples, was named Marcus Reyes, a real estate developer from outside Charleston. Michael watched them through the evening, watched Diane work a small crowd with practiced ease, watched her rest her hand on Marcus Reyes's arm with the same familiar gesture she had once used on him, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that whatever this new life was, it had not been assembled quickly. He noticed things a stranger would not have noticed. The particular way she deflected a question about her hometown with a light joke rather than an answer. The practiced ease with which she introduced herself using a story about a late husband, not a living one, a detail that landed on Michael with a strange, cold irony he did not know what to do with. She had built an entire biography, complete with its own grief, its own convenient tragedy, borrowed, it seemed, from the very life she had actually escaped. He wondered, standing at the edge of that group with a club soda he wasn't drinking, how many other rooms she had walked into over 4 years, telling some version of this same practice story to people who had no reason to doubt her. Michael did not take out his phone. He did not photograph her. Instead, drawing on 30 years of instinct for verifying a claim quietly before ever confronting the person behind it, he walked to the ship's guest services desk under the pretext of a billing question and asked, almost offhandedly, whether a stateroom account under the name Marsh had a dinner reservation adjustment pending, watching the attendance screen just long enough to see a booking confirm the name Danielle Marsh, cabin number, and a second traveler listed as Reyes. It gave him nothing he could act on legally, but it gave him certainty, which was, for the moment, enough. He walked the length of the ship twice after that, not toward her, but simply to move, the way he had once paced a parking lot outside a claims hearing he knew he was going to lose. He thought about how easily the attendant had turned the screen slightly toward him. Unprompted, the small, ordinary courtesy of someone helping a paying guest, never once suspecting that the man asking a routine question about a dinner reservation was, in fact, confirming that his legally deceased wife was traveling under a stranger's name 4 decks above him. It struck him, standing at the rail afterward, that this was precisely the kind of quiet, procedural gap he had spent his entire career trained to close, and that he had walked directly into the one instance of it that had ever touched his own life. That night, in his cabin, Michael made two calls, one to a private investigator he had used years earlier in his claims work, and one to Detective Carla Whitmore, the officer who had originally overseen the search for Diane and signed the case closed as an accidental drowning. He gave her the booking name, the cabin details, and a description of the man traveling with her, and asked her, in a voice steadier than he felt, to look into whether a woman legally declared dead 4 years earlier could somehow be booked on a cruise manifest under a different name entirely, laughing on a deck with a man she had apparently known long enough to build an entire second identity around. Whitmore was quiet on the line for a long moment before she told him she would call him back within the hour. She called back in 40 minutes, her voice noticeably different than it had been, careful in a new way. She told Michael that a preliminary check of the name Danielle Marsh connected to a Social Security number belonging to a woman who had died in Ohio years earlier, a detail that meant this was not a spontaneous disappearance, but something built, purchased, and maintained over time. She told him not to approach the couple directly, that whatever was happening needed to be handled carefully to preserve any case that might follow. Michael listened, agreed, and then, unable to sit with the waiting, did exactly what she had told him not to do the following morning. Michael did not sleep that night. He sat at the small desk in his cabin, replaying the booking screen in his mind. The name Danielle Marsh, the second traveler listed as Reyes, turning it over the way he had once turned over a fraudulent claim file, looking for whatever had been there all along that he had simply failed to see in his own marriage. He thought about the 2 years before the accident, the withdrawals, the vague trips, the phone kept face down on the counter, and understood now that none of it had been small. He thought about Robert Sinclair's calm efficiency through the entire legal process, a calm that made a different kind of sense to him now, and felt something in his chest that was not quite anger yet, more like the early tremor before structure gives way. He considered, in those hours before dawn, every version of the conversation he might have with her. He considered walking away entirely, saying nothing, leaving her to whatever life she had built, and simply going home to tell Grace the truth without ever confronting her mother directly. He considered calling the ship's security immediately and having her detained before she could disappear again, this time for good. In the end, he chose neither extreme, deciding that whatever came next, he needed to hear it from her directly, needed to understand, if such understanding was even possible, how a woman he had loved for 22 years had found it easier to let him bury an empty casket than to simply tell him the truth. He approached her directly on a quiet stretch of deck before the breakfast crowds arrived. Diane's face, when she saw him, did not register the shock of a stranger being mistaken for someone else, but the specific, sinking recognition of a person finally caught. She did not deny who she was. Instead, over the next hour, sitting across from her husband for the first time in 4 years, Diane began to explain, haltingly, that the plan had never been about Marcus Reyes at all, that she had met him only afterward, and that the disappearance had been about escaping a marriage that had quietly suffocated her long before any storm, a version of Michael from years earlier who had, in her account, controlled far more of her life than he remembered controlling. She told him, in that hour, that the idea had first come to her nearly 3 years before the accident, not as a plan, but as a passing thought, the kind of thought people have and immediately dismiss. What if I simply wasn't here anymore? She said the thought returned more often than she expected, until it stopped feeling impossible and started feeling, instead, like the only option left that didn't involve years of lawyers and custody arrangements and the particular public unraveling of a marriage everyone believed was solid. She said she loved Grace completely, that leaving her had been the single hardest thing she had ever done, and that not a single day of the past 4 years had passed without thinking about her daughter's face at a graveside that held nothing real inside it. Michael asked her only one question directly in that hour, his voice level in a way that surprised even him. He asked whether any of it, the 22 years, the wedding, the anniversaries, Grace's childhood, had been real to her, or whether he had simply been a chapter she had already decided to close long before she ever stepped onto that boat. Diane did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, she said that the marriage had been real, that her love for their daughter had never once been in question, but that somewhere along the way she had lost the ability to imagine a version of her own life that did not require someone else's permission to exist, and that faking her death, however monstrous it looked from the outside, had felt, at the time, like the only door that led somewhere she could breathe. Michael listened to all of it without speaking, and later would say that the hardest part of that conversation was not the anger he expected to feel, but the strange, disorienting grief of realizing he might never fully know which parts of his marriage had been real. Detective Carla Whitmore's investigation moved quickly once it began. Within 2 weeks, she had confirmed that the DNA sample used to identify Diane's supposed remains had, in fact, belonged to an unrelated woman. A sample swap carried out at a small private forensics lab in Savannah, where a courier later admitted, under questioning, to diverting sample vials in exchange for cash, a scheme connected, through banking records, directly to attorney Robert Sinclair. Sinclair, it emerged, had structured the estate not out of friendship, but for a percentage of the payout itself, an arrangement he had made privately with Diane more than a year before she ever stepped onto the boat, meaning the entire tragedy Michael had grieved for 4 years had been planned, financed, and legally engineered long before the storm ever arrived. Whitmore's team began by re-examining the original identification file, cross-referencing the DNA profile against the actual medical history of the woman it had originally belonged to, an unclaimed patient from Cincinnati Hospice who, investigators eventually confirmed, had died of natural causes around the same time as the boating accident. Her own sample vial quietly and briefly diverted before being logged back into the chain of custody under a substitute case number. It was a detail that had taken the original investigation exactly 0 effort to overlook, since no one at the time had any reason to doubt a positive identification delivered efficiently and without complication. Whitmore has said that reconstructing this single substitution took her team nearly 9 days of records requests across 2 state systems, a task made significantly easier by the fact that Sinclair, confident the case would never be reopened, had kept remarkably little effort to conceal his own paper trail once someone finally went looking. The unraveling accelerated once investigators obtained a warrant for Sinclair's office computer, recovering a series of emails, carefully worded but ultimately unambiguous, exchanged with a broker specializing in what one email openly referred to as identity transition services, a euphemism prosecutors would later present to the jury as evidence that everyone involved understood exactly what they were building. Sinclair's own calendar, recovered in the same search, corroborated meetings with Diane at intervals that lined up precisely with major steps in the plan: the Social Security purchase, the apartment lease under the name Danielle Marsh, and finally, roughly 3 weeks before the accident, a meeting logged simply as final review. Grace attended portions of the trial in person, sitting several rows behind the prosecution, close enough to hear her mother's voice for the first time in 4 years, but far enough to avoid direct eye contact for most of the proceedings. She has described the strange sensation of hearing Diane's voice again, unchanged in its cadence, its warmth, the same voice that had once read her bedtime stories, now describing in clinical detail the mechanics of a plan to disappear from her own daughter's life. Grace left the courtroom twice during testimony, both times returning within minutes. Unwilling, she said later, to give her mother the impression that she could not bear to stay and listen. The financial trail, once investigators began pulling it apart, told a story more disciplined than anyone initially suspected. Diane had spent nearly 2 years quietly setting up the elements of a second life, a Social Security number purchased from a broker who specialized in exactly this kind of arrangement, a small apartment rented under the name Danielle Marsh in a town 3 hours from where she and Michael lived, a bank account opened slowly, in small increments, to avoid the kind of reporting thresholds that might draw attention. Sinclair had advised her, according to records recovered from his own office computer, on precisely which thresholds to avoid, guidance that made clear he had understood from the beginning exactly what he was helping to build. Grace Ashford, now 22, learned of her mother's survival not from Michael, but from a phone call with Detective Whitmore requesting a formal statement, and the news landed on her with a complexity that surprised even Grace herself. She was not simply angry, though anger came quickly and stayed. She found herself grieving a second time, this time for the mother she had actually known, who now seemed to have existed alongside a woman capable of watching her own child cry at a graveside without intervening. Diane, for her part, insisted through her attorney that she had never intended for Grace or Michael to suffer, that the plan had spiraled beyond her control almost immediately, and that walking back into their lives at any point had felt, to her, impossible rather than simply difficult. Grace has described the days immediately following that phone call as some of the strangest of her life, a period in which she found herself pulling out old photo albums she hadn't opened in years, studying pictures of her mother from before the accident with an entirely new kind of scrutiny, searching for something in her expression that might have hinted at what was coming. She found nothing conclusive, only ordinary photographs of an ordinary, happy-seeming woman, a detail that unsettled her more than any hidden clue would have, the realization that a person can carry an entire secret future behind a completely unremarkable smile. She has said this, more than anything else about the case, is what she thinks about most, not the fraud itself, but the sheer, quiet capacity people have to seem exactly like themselves while planning to become someone else entirely. The deeper the investigation went, the harder it became to draw a clean line between predator and woman escaping an impossible situation. Interviews with people who had known the marriage in its later years suggested Michael had, without recognizing it in himself, become controlling in subtle ways after Grace was born, monitoring finances closely, discouraging friendships he found threatening, behavior he described, when confronted with it directly by Detective Whitmore, as simply protective rather than restrictive. Diane's choice to fake her own death rather than pursue an ordinary divorce remained, to investigators and to Michael himself, the one detail that resisted easy sympathy, a decision that inflicted 4 years of real grief on a child who had done nothing to deserve it. Marcus Reyes, questioned separately by federal investigators, maintained throughout that he had known nothing of Danielle Marsh's true identity, that he had met her at a real estate conference 18 months after her disappearance and believed entirely the story she had given him, a young widow starting over after losing a husband to illness. His account was ultimately corroborated by financial records showing no unusual transfers between them, and he was never charged, though he has said publicly that discovering the truth felt like losing a person twice, once to a story that was never real, and once to the truth that replaced it. In the one interview Marcus gave after the case became public, he described the moment federal agents first approached him at his office in Charleston, how the ground beneath an entire relationship had shifted in the space of a single conversation. He recalled small details of their years together that he had never once questioned, a birthday she claimed, but which turned out to belong to Diane's actual birth records under her real name, a family history she described in careful, emotional detail that he now understood to be almost entirely invented. He said the hardest part was not the deception itself, but realizing that a woman he had planned to marry had rehearsed her own biography so thoroughly that even her tears, when she spoke of a fictional late husband, had seemed completely genuine to him at the time. The lab career at the center of the falsified identification, a man named Owen Pratt, cooperated fully once investigators approached him, and his account added a detail that complicated the case further. He said Sinclair had approached him not through Diane directly, but through a third party, a fact that suggested Sinclair had built a small, careful network of people willing to divert forensic samples for a price, and that Diane's case, while the most lucrative, may not have been the only one. Federal investigators reopened 2 other closed cases in neighboring counties as a result, both involving life insurance payouts following unrecovered bodies, though as of the trial neither had produced conclusive evidence of similar fraud. Pratt described the exchange itself as almost unremarkable at the time, a manila envelope of cash left in his vehicle in exchange for a 15-minute window during which 2 sample vials were switched during routine transport between the recovery site and the lab's intake desk, a gap in the chain of custody so brief that no protocol at the time was designed to catch it. He said he had told himself, in the years since, that he was simply moving paperwork faster for people who needed closure, a rationalization he admitted. Under questioning, he no longer believed, even as he had been telling it to himself. His testimony became one of the more damaging pieces of evidence against Sinclair, precisely because it demonstrated how little institutional effort had been required to manufacture a lie that would hold for 4 years. Sinclair's testimony, once he began cooperating, revealed a timeline more calculated than even Whitmore had initially suspected. He described meeting with Diane on 4 separate occasions in the 18 months before the accident, each meeting logged in his calendar under vague headings like estate review or client consultation, meetings during which they discussed not whether the plan would work, but which method of disappearance would draw the least suspicion. Diane, according to Sinclair, had initially considered simply leaving, filing for divorce, and relocating, but had grown convinced, through conversations Sinclair described as increasingly detailed, that a clean legal severance combined with a payout would give her a more complete kind of freedom than divorce ever could. Prosecutors, presenting this timeline in court, argued that the emotional narrative Diane offered, one of a suffocating marriage and an impulsive escape, did not match the deliberate, multi-year planning the evidence showed. Diane's defense countered that the years of planning were themselves evidence of how trapped she had felt, that a woman does not spend 18 months quietly building an escape route unless she has exhausted every other option available to her. The jury would ultimately have to weigh both accounts against each other, a task that took them the better part of 4 days. One piece of evidence the prosecution returned to more than once was the compass pendant itself, still in Diane's possession at the time of her arrest, worn openly under an assumed name for 4 years. Prosecutors argued that a woman attempting a clean, calculated break from her old life would have discarded something so identifiable almost immediately, and that her decision to keep wearing it spoke to a genuine, unresolved attachment to the marriage she had otherwise worked so hard to erase. The defense offered the opposite reading, that the pendant was simply the one small piece of her old self she had allowed herself to keep, proof less of ongoing love than of the impossibility of erasing 22 years cleanly, however methodically a person plans to try. Diane Ashford and attorney Robert Sinclair were both charged with insurance fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of public records, and the $2 million payout became the subject of a lengthy civil recovery effort that would take years to resolve. Sinclair, facing the possibility of disbarment and a lengthy federal sentence, ultimately agreed to a plea arrangement that required him to testify against Diane in exchange for a reduced term, testimony that filled in the remaining gaps in the timeline, including the exact date, nearly 2 years before the boating accident, that the two of them had first discussed the plan over what Sinclair described almost clinically as a routine conversation about estate planning. Michael, questioned extensively about his own knowledge of the scheme, was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, though the experience left him publicly humiliated in a way no court proceeding could fully repair. Former colleagues who had known him for decades as a meticulous investigator of exactly this kind of fraud found the irony impossible to ignore, and Michael has said since that this, more than the betrayal itself, was the detail that took the longest to make peace with, the fact that the one lie he never questioned was the one closest to him. A few colleagues reached out privately in the months afterward, not with judgment, but with an odd kind of solidarity, several admitting they too had, at various points in their own marriages, chosen not to look closely at something they suspected, because looking closely felt, at the time, like a betrayal of its own. Grace chose, in the months that followed, to limit contact with her mother to occasional supervised visits, unwilling to fully close the door, unable to fully open it either. She has said, in the only comment she has made publicly about the case, that she does not know yet whether forgiveness is something she owes her mother or something her mother has to earn back one visit at a time, and that she is in no hurry to decide which. Michael sold the house on Maple Run for a second time, this time not out of grief, but out of a need to stop living inside the architecture of a lie he had mistaken for a marriage. The jury ultimately convicted Diane on all counts of fraud and conspiracy, though they acquitted her on one lesser charge related to obstruction, a split verdict that reporters at the time read as evidence the jury had, in fact, wrestled seriously with the complexity of her circumstances rather than viewing her simply as calculating. She was sentenced to 7 years, a term her attorney described as harsh given the absence of any violence in the case, and one that victims' advocates described as lenient given the scale of the fraud and the years of genuine grief it had caused two people who had done nothing to deserve it. Robert Sinclair, whose cooperation reduced his own exposure considerably, received 4 years in permanent disbarment, ending a legal career that had spanned nearly 3 decades. On the day of sentencing, Diane addressed the courtroom directly for the first time since her arraignment, turning briefly toward the section where Michael and Grace sat, and offering an apology that Michael has described since as neither fully convincing nor fully hollow, somewhere in the uncomfortable middle where most real apologies actually live. She said she had spent every day of her new life aware of what it had cost the people she loved, and that no explanation she could offer would ever be adequate to the years she had taken from her daughter. Grace did not respond in the courtroom, sitting perfectly still through the statement, and has said since that she has not yet decided whether she believes it, only that she noticed, for the first time in the entire proceeding, something that looked like genuine grief crossing her mother's face. In the months following sentencing, Michael found himself approached, unexpectedly, by other people who recognized pieces of their own marriages in the story once it became public, spouses who wrote to him describing their own quiet unease about a partner's distance, their own dismissed suspicions, their own withdrawal from joint accounts they had once explained away. Michael has said he does not consider himself equipped to offer anyone advice, only to say that the signs, in hindsight, are rarely as invisible as they feel in the moment, and that trusting a person does not require refusing to notice when something in the pattern of a life together quietly changes. The civil recovery effort surrounding the $2 million payout dragged on for nearly 3 years after the criminal case concluded, complicated by the fact that much of the money had already been spent, invested, or absorbed into a life Diane had built under a different name. Michael's attorneys ultimately recovered a little over half of the original sum, a portion he has since donated, quietly and without public announcement, to a legal aid organization that assists families navigating fraudulent death and identity cases, a decision he has described simply as wanting something useful to come out of money that never should have existed in the first place. Grace has since returned to school, part-time, to study forensic psychology, a direction she attributes, without much hesitation, to needing to understand the mechanics of exactly this kind of deception, not to excuse it, she says, but to make sure she never again mistakes the absence of obvious cruelty for the presence of honesty. She visits her mother now roughly once every 2 months, conversations she describes as still careful, still incomplete, but no longer entirely closed. She has said the hardest part of these visits is not anger, which has softened somewhat with time, but the ordinary, disorienting familiarity of her mother's voice, still exactly the voice of the woman who raised her, attached now to a version of events Grace is still learning how to fully hold. What remains unresolved, long after the courtroom proceedings ended, is not the question of what Diane did, but the harder question of why two people who once built a life together arrived at a place where disappearing felt more possible than simply telling the truth. Michael has said, in the only interview he ever gave about the case, that he no longer trusts his own memory of their marriage, that every warm recollection now arrives paired with a doubt he cannot fully silence. Whether Diane Ashford was a woman who calculated her way out of an inconvenient life, or a woman who felt she had no honest way out of a difficult one, remains a question the people closest to this story continue to answer differently. Was justice truly and fully served here? Or did the system simply punish the version of dishonesty it was equipped to see, while leaving the quieter one unexamined? Would you have noticed the signs Michael missed? The withdrawals, the distance, the calm attorney handling every detail a little too smoothly? Or do we only ever see these things clearly once someone tells us where to look? This is, in the end, a story less about a single act of deception and more about how many small, ordinary silences it takes to build one. Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Michael's place. And if this story kept you until the very end, subscribe for more real accounts of trust broken and quietly, unexpectedly rebuilt.